What if the single greatest barrier standing between you and the life you genuinely want has absolutely nothing to do with how disciplined you are, how clever your strategy is, or how hard you're willing to grind? What if that barrier is something far more insidious, your commitment to staying realistic? Carl Jung stumbled onto something extraordinary during what may be the most dangerous psychological experiment in modern history, one he ran entirely on himself, and the results turned virtually everything the psychiatric world believed about ambition, desire, and human potential completely on its head. What he found was that the individuals who gripped reality the tightest were invariably the ones most imprisoned by it. And the ones willing to release their stranglehold on what could be seen, measured, and proven were the ones who remade their lives in ways that looked, from the outside, like extraordinary luck. Today, we're going to walk through what Jung actually uncovered when he stopped trusting the obvious, how his framework exposes why being realistic is frequently the most self-destructive posture a person can take. And what begins to happen when you learn to collaborate with the part of your mind that has no interest in reality whatsoever, because it's too occupied building something better. This is not manifestation culture. This is not, think positively and let the universe deliver. What Jung discovered was far stranger, far more grounded, and far more uncomfortable than any of that, because it demands something that most people will never be willing to do. Abandon the map that everyone around you is using, and trust that you can navigate terrain that has no map yet. In 1913, Jung did something that would have destroyed most careers. He was already one of the most celebrated psychiatrists in all of Europe, Freud's hand-picked successor, the brightest name in psychoanalysis, a man whose professional future seemed as locked in as a future can be. And he walked away from all of it. The prestige, the security, the certainty, gone. He chose instead to conduct an experiment that his colleagues would later characterize as a complete nervous breakdown. He began deliberately listening to his unconscious mind. He would sit in his study, close his eyes, and allow images to surface. He didn't rush to interpret them. He didn't force them into rational frameworks. He let them arrive on their own terms, engaged with them as though they were real, and documented everything in what eventually became the Red Book. A massive, illustrated personal journal that reads like the diary of a man walking through the interior of his own mind carrying only a lantern. His colleagues were convinced he'd cracked. His professional network contracted. The sensible move would have been to hold the course, keep publishing, keep building the reputation that was already well established. Instead, he disregarded every external signal telling him what was safe, practical, or wise. He went inward. What emerged from that period, which stretched across several years, became the bedrock of nearly everything we now associate with Jungian psychology: archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, shadow work, active imagination. All of it was born during a stretch of time when Carl Jung looked at consensus reality and said, in effect, I believe there's something more truthful underneath all of this. And here is what makes this directly relevant to you right now. Jung didn't merely develop theory during that period. He developed a method, a precise way of engaging with the dimensions of mind that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And what he found was that those neglected dimensions, the unconscious, the shadow, the archetypal currents flowing beneath your daily decisions, aren't just compelling psychological concepts. They are the actual architects of your life. Let's start with what reality actually is from a Jungian perspective. Most people relate to reality as though it's a fixed terrain. There are facts. There are circumstances. There are limits. You survey the landscape, you form reasonable plans, and you execute. This is the approach every sensible person adopts, and Jung would have agreed with it, to a point. He was a scientist. He respected observation and evidence. But he kept encountering something in his patients, in his research, and eventually in himself, that demanded an explanation. The people most devoted to being realistic were consistently, reliably, the most stuck. They could describe their constraints with stunning precision. They knew exactly why they couldn't change careers, couldn't leave the relationship, couldn't pursue the thing that pulled them out of sleep at 3 in the morning with a feeling they had no name for. Their reasoning was bulletproof. Their logic was airtight. And they were profoundly miserable. Meanwhile, the patients who underwent the most dramatic transformations, the ones whose lives genuinely shifted, shared a recognizable pattern. At some point, each of them had made a decision that couldn't be justified on paper. They had followed an impulse their rational mind couldn't defend. They had taken a step that the people around them called reckless, naive, or completely out of touch with reality. Jung would have called this alignment with the self. The deeper center of the personality that lives beneath the ego's endless calculations. The ego trades in probability, risk analysis, and social comparison. The self trades in something categorically different, wholeness, the becoming of what you actually are, regardless of whether it looks sensible from the outside. And this is precisely where most people lose the thread, because the self doesn't communicate in the language the ego understands. It speaks in images, in dreams, in sudden impulses that seem absurd, in that persistent undercurrent of wrongness even when everything on the surface appears fine. It speaks in the gap between what you tell people you want and what you actually want, between the life you've assembled and the life that keeps haunting you. Picture someone who has spent 15 years in a career that made complete sense. They chose it for sound reasons, stability, respect, a clear trajectory. They're competent at it. Their parents are proud. The resume is impressive. And every single morning, something tightens in their chest when the alarm sounds. They've learned to label it stress. They've learned to manage it, with exercise, meditation, weekend getaways. They've become so skilled at managing the tightness that they nearly forget it's there. But it's there. Every morning. 15 years of mornings. Jung would look at this person and see something very precise. He would see an ego that has successfully built a life using external criteria, safety, approval, predictability, while the self, the deeper core of who this person truly is, has been sending signals for 15 years that have been systematically suppressed by realistic thinking. Every time that person imagined changing direction and then talked themselves out of it, I have a mortgage. I'm too far in to start over. What would people say? They were choosing the ego's map over the self's compass. And Jung's entire body of work suggests that this choice, made repeatedly over enough time, doesn't just produce unhappiness. It makes you sick. It generates anxiety, depression, physical symptoms. It creates the conditions for what he called neurosis. Which is really just the psyche's escalating alarm when it has been ignored for too long. So when we say, ignore reality, we mean something more precise than it sounds. We mean, ignore the ego's version of reality. Ignore the story your rational mind has assembled about what's achievable, what's practical, what you deserve, and what the world will permit. Because that story, however convincing it sounds, is almost always too small. Here is where things get genuinely strange. Where Jung's work diverges from anything resembling standard personal development. Jung discovered that the unconscious doesn't simply sit there, passively filing away memories and suppressed feelings. It actively organizes your experience. It selects what you notice. It determines which opportunities you perceive and which you walk directly past. It sculpts your perception so thoroughly that two people can move through the same day in the same city and have radically different experiences. Because their unconscious patterns are filtering reality in completely different ways. He called this projection, and it's one of his most powerful and most misunderstood ideas. Projection isn't merely about attributing your own flaws to other people, though it includes that. It's about the fact that your unconscious is perpetually projecting a version of reality onto the world, and then you respond to the projection as though it were the world itself. Think about what this means practically. If your unconscious is organized around the conviction that you are fundamentally not enough, a conviction you probably absorbed before you had language for it, then your entire perceptual system is calibrated to confirm that belief. You'll notice criticism more readily than praise. You'll read ambiguity as rejection. You'll register closed doors more vividly than open ones. You'll call this being clear-eyed about your limitations, and it will feel like honesty. It will feel like maturity. And it will be a cage. Jung saw that this projection system operates regardless of your awareness of it. The question is never whether your unconscious is shaping your reality, it is, right now, as you take this in. The question is whether the patterns it's running are genuinely yours, consciously chosen, or whether they're inherited from wounds, family dynamics, and cultural conditioning that you never agreed to absorb. This is why Jung placed such weight on making the unconscious conscious. His most famous observation, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, is the most practical sentence he ever wrote. It sounds philosophical. It is actually a blueprint for getting unstuck. So how do you actually do this? How do you ignore reality in a way that produces real results rather than pure delusion? Jung's method was specific. It centered on a practice he called active imagination. It sounds deceptively simple and turns out to be one of the most demanding psychological exercises a person can attempt. Here is how it works. You sit with whatever has you stuck. The paralysis, the anxiety, the inexplicable pull towards something you can't rationally defend, and instead of analyzing it, you allow it to present itself as an image. You give it space. You let the unconscious show you something. Perhaps it's a figure, a landscape, a scene unfolding. You don't direct it. You don't judge it. You engage with it the way you would engage with a real person in a real conversation. Jung practiced this for years. He would encounter figures in his imagination. Some terrifying, some profoundly wise, some deeply contradictory, and he would hold actual dialogues with them. He would ask questions and receive answers that his conscious mind had not generated. Those answers frequently unsettled him. They challenged his assumptions. They pointed him in directions his ego would never have willingly selected. And those directions consistently turned out to be correct. What Jung was doing, and what this practice allows anyone to do, is tapping a source of intelligence that operates on entirely different principles than the rational mind. The rational mind works through extrapolation. It examines what has existed and projects it forward. This makes it excellent for maintenance. It makes it almost useless for transformation, because transformation requires perceiving possibilities that don't yet exist anywhere in your accumulated data. The unconscious carries no such limitation. It works through patterns, symbols, and connections that the rational mind cannot trace. It perceives the whole picture at once, while the ego can only hold the piece directly in front of it. And when you learn to access it deliberately, through active imagination, through serious attention to dreams, through following the irrational impulses you keep dismissing, you begin operating with a form of intelligence most people don't even know they possess. If you've been sitting with that restless pull, the one telling you that something about your life needs to change even though you can't articulate what, you are already hearing exactly what Jung spent years learning to listen to. Let me be clear about something important, though. This process doesn't unfold the way the premise of this might suggest. You don't get everything you want, instantly. What actually happens is both slower and more radical than that. What happens is that your definition of everything you want changes. Jung observed this pattern again and again. A patient would arrive seeking something specific, a better relationship, career advancement, relief from chronic anxiety. And through the work of engaging the unconscious, integrating the shadow, and discovering what the deeper self genuinely needed, the thing they wanted would transform. Sometimes it expanded beyond anything they'd imagined. Sometimes it simplified into something they would never have thought to ask for. Sometimes they discovered that what they'd been chasing was a substitute for something far more fundamental, something they had abandoned hope for years, sometimes decades, earlier. Imagine someone who spent a decade relentlessly pursuing career achievement, because somewhere around age 11, they learned that accomplishment was the only reliable currency for earning their father's attention. That belief didn't stay a belief. It went underground. It stopped being something they thought and became something they lived, obvious, unquestioned, invisible. So they built an entire life around it. They optimized for achievement. They sacrificed connection, rest, genuine curiosity, and play, all the things that didn't produce measurable returns, because the unconscious pattern had determined that those things weren't safe. Only achievement was safe. And then, through whatever door they eventually walked through, therapy, crisis, a silence that lasted long enough for the truth to surface, that pattern becomes conscious. They see it. They see the 11-year-old. They see the father. They see the deal they struck before they understood they were making any deal at all. And suddenly, everything they want is no longer a corner office and a six-figure number. Maybe those things are still part of it, or maybe they aren't. But the wanting itself has changed. It is coming from them now, from the self, rather than from a wound that had learned to wear the costume of ambition. And what a person pursues from that place carries a completely different quality. It fits. It doesn't require them to perform their way through every single day. It resonates with something the body recognizes before the mind has caught up. That alignment is what people on the outside call luck. It's what they call things just falling into place. It appears instantaneous from a distance because they didn't witness the interior work that preceded it.